I've got a question for the panel. Our theme for the conference is global interchanges and the resurgence of the skyscraper. What inspiration and lessons can each of you, for the cities that you've presented on, learn from being here in New York? I might start with you, Karl.
Sorry. Well, New York is one of the great cities in the world, and it just works at many, many levels. And for me, it's a testament to not be afraid of tall buildings, of dense buildings. And certainly in Melbourne, there's a lot of fear about what tall buildings can bring, the impacts that they have on the neighbourhood, and we're just not used to them. So we're starting to come of age, and I think that New York is a fantastic exemplar of how a tall city, a skyscraper city, can be just innovative in each of the building blocks of the city, interesting, engaging, sculptural, bring incredible population, bring incredible opportunities.
Thanks, Karl. Philip?
I think the main thing... Do we need to press that? Okay. The main thing is density in New York just creates... There's enough people to create a vibrant city. It's just alive 24 hours a day. And I think that density is one of the things that drives it being a great city. The other thing that clearly relates back to my talk is how well integrated transport is with density. It makes New York a workable city, and you get great transport nodes like we're right next door to one in Grand Central, and there's incredible density around there, and it works very well. We're seeing an amazing development down at Hudson Yards, integrating with the train system at Penn Station. So I think that integration of transport and density makes it a great city that gives us all lessons to learn.
This may sound a little odd, but Brisbane's not that different from New York in one sense, in that we're very constrained geographically. So we're bound by the river in the same way that New York is. And so there's this temptation in Brisbane always to let this, the CBD sort of spurt out into other parts around it. And I guess, like Karl, I'd say New York shows what happens when you have the nerve to say, no, hang on, let's just be super intense in this area. And I guess the other one that I've found really has been a good experience this week being in New York is where there's been investment in public realm, how much that's really counted for quality. So, you go down to the High Line area, for example, and what that's doing for that whole neighbourhood, and where there are those little treasures of public space like Washington Square Park and those little pieces of public territory where there's been investment in quality, what commercial dividends but huge livability dividends there are also in investing in public space when you're allowing intensity of development.
We do have a few more minutes. There's a Design Excellence initiative that was introduced into Sydney in 2000 by the City of Sydney Council, and it aims to trigger a competitive design process. And I know a lot of consultants that have had to go through that process, international teams and so on being brought in as part of that process. Perhaps a question for you, Philip. To what extent do you think that this initiative has affected your ability as a leading designer in Sydney to achieve design excellence? And how would you compare that to your colleagues in Melbourne?
It's a good question, Josh. Just to expand that a little bit, so it's a statutory requirement in Sydney for all buildings over 50 metres in the central Sydney area to have a design competition with a minimum of 5 competitors. And there is a bonus, there's a 10% floor space bonus, so developers are, in a sense, paid in kind for those competitions. It's certainly, and I'd be interested in Caroline and Karl's comments because I know their firms have both competed in these competitions. It does give you a very intense 5-week design period to look at a building. Probably one of the advantages of it is that it's a period in which, as an architect, you can think about what is the best design for that building. perhaps without having a developer client saying, we can't afford that, we can't do that, and controlling you, you have a 5-week clear period to think about that building. It also places probably a bit more design control in the architects than, particularly Sydney was developing a very developer-oriented city. It's got the highest land cost in Australia and a very long and difficult planning process. And all of that's added to development costs and led developers down the cheapest path of development. And I think the aim of the competitions has reversed some of that power balance back towards architects. So it's, I think, been quite exceptional in terms of the quality of buildings that have been put out in Sydney in the last 15 years. It's certainly benefited our firm, which is a firm that's a very old firm in Melbourne, but has only been in Sydney for 20 years. And it's given us the ability through design to win projects rather than needing that network of social contacts. And none of the directors in our Sydney office are Sydney born and raised people. So it's enabled us through design only to get large projects in the central Sydney area. But I'd be interested in the others' comments on that.
Well, competitions are designed to bring out, the best possible solution on any given site. And if you look around the world, Europe, a lot of the work has to be gained through competition. There's some fantastic examples of outstanding buildings and urban design solutions that have come through competitions. In a competition, as an architect, you can't sit on your hands. You've really got to think about, what's required and how you're going to bring some majesty to the solution. I don't see any problem with competitions. I think they're an incentive.
Karl, just with the competition process in Sydney, it's obviously coming from the council rather than from the developer. Do you, just staying on sort of Melbourne-Sydney rivalry, I suppose,
There's no Melbourne or Sydney rivalry.
Design in Melbourne, I mean, Melbourne would say, when I travel to Melbourne or speak to Melburnians, we've got these interesting buildings. You go down the expressway and there's the yellow cheese stick or whatever you want to call it. And what do you see?
That's the city gateway.
What do you see a difference in design outcome through that process in Melbourne being very different, and Brisbane, of course, as well, Caroline, to Sydney?
It's a different process, but well, what can I say? Melbourne is a very intense design climate, at any rate, and I think the architects there are very, very conscious, in the most part, to achieve great outcomes. So I suppose, look, the question initially was, does a competition reduce or make it harder for the architect? And so these are just two different ways of getting to solutions. It all depends on the architects, and it also all depends on the jury.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to add that it's extremely political. So Brisbane has been crying out for a process like that for years, and we've just, with this boom that we're having, there are some projects, really very, very significant large projects that are going on site, within the next year or two, that I would have to say really would have benefited greatly from a design competition process. They are not highly skilled pieces of design for the scale and importance of that they have in our city. But it's very subject to politics. So I've been on an advisory board to government 2 governments ago, where we nearly got that design competition system implemented in our city. Then there was the change of government, and we're just starting to work again with the 3rd government who's come back in, of the other political persuasion, to try and get something like that happening in the city, so that these really significant projects are not, going through without the benefit of peer review, design quality checks, really good designers being involved in them. It's terribly important.
Thank you. Yes, sure.
Is it working? Yeah. directed really to Philip. The contrast between the three cities and the presentations was marked. Sydney 2050, big vision, incredibly ambitious. And what's kind of maybe desirable, and what I saw in the presentation on Brisbane was to actually look at some of what the fabric might be, as opposed to the really just this kind of, bubble or a massive sort of kind of silver hedgehog of buildings. In order to support the ambition, maybe another level of some detail, what happens at street, what happens at gardens in the sky, etc., would assist a lot, because it really is scary if you just see this massing, just a thought, yeah.
It's a good thought. Look, I'll talk about two things. I guess you mentioned ambitious. It was a very ambitious vision. And we initially created something that was clearly not of that scale. And we just thought, if we are going to make an impact, and it was purely a vision, and its impact was to be political. And interestingly, in the 18 months since it was done, the Premier of the state has now come out and said he supports increased height. That has had an on effect on the city government, who are now doing their own study called Sustainable Density, which is looking at, can the city increase height limits in line with the Premier's vision. And the metro line in Sydney has now recommenced. So 6 years ago, the state government had a metro plan. It was abandoned. And when we did this study, it was really a political push to say we need a transport system, we need a transport solution, and we have a city that at the moment has a cap limit about growth. So we were putting them together, and the whole study was political pressure exerted by the Urban Task Force, who commissioned it, and it's had a substantial impact. And to get that impact, we pumped it up. We wanted to shock people, we wanted to give them that step change shock, if you like, and cause a lot of debate, and it was very successful in that. It was a very short study, and it literally didn't have the scope to go down in detail at the street level and really fine grain. But I think your point is well made. To make that a serious study, we need to go to the next levels. But it was a very fast study, with intent of getting media attention and having political impact. And from that point of view, it was very successful. And as I said, there's been substantial changes in our city in the 18 months since those studies were done. And I won't say it was directly related, but it was post these studies. Well, the Premier literally a month later came out and supported additional height, and a lot of things have happened indirectly as a result of these studies.
I would just add to that and say that Melbourne actually doesn't have a vision. In fact, it's ruled by opposing political parties. And if there was a bipartisan, clear, wonderful vision, I think Melbourne would be in the future a far greater place. Luckily, we've needed development, we've needed people in the city, and so the lack of a vision has been a little disguised by the fact that it's become a fantastic, vibrant, fifth year running, the most livable city in the world. Or did I say that before? But that's that. At this moment in time, that's couched the fact that we do not have a clear and committed vision from any of the political parties. So it comes down to architects, designers, urban designers, in industry doing the best they can wherever they touch the city. In fact, it's worse than that. Whatever little vision one government might have is thrown out the door when the next government comes in. So it's the minister we have at the moment is very kind of neutral on development. He's very cautious. He's putting a bit of a scare into the industry. The last minister, on the other hand, of planning was very avant-garde and pushed development, and it's black and white over one election change. It's a strange and crazy and not a good situation, really.
Perhaps one other thing to add is if you go back to those comparative images I showed of the city, I believe if you'd shown the image of Sydney today to someone in the late 60s and said that's what Sydney will be like in 50 years' time, they would have had exactly that reaction. And that was the point of showing over these 50-year periods that it does look a bit of a shock today. But out of interest, none of those buildings were over 600 metres. So none of them were anywhere near the tallest building in the world. I think there was 2 buildings at around 600. There are a bunch at about 400-ish. So we're not talking about creating skylines that are about the tallest in the world, but it's a shock today. And I think if I'd shown a vision of what Sydney is today to someone in the late 60s, they would have just had the same reaction, shook their head and said, there is no way that will be a livable city. And yet it's a highly livable city today.